Welcome to 502 Conversations. I'm Brian Kirby, and my guest for this episode is once again Dr. Paul Offit. Dr. Offit, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you.
You're welcome, and thank you for being here. I don't know if this is our 9th conversation or not. We are taping this on the 28th of January, so by the time it gets edited and published, who knows what's changed. But we'll do the best that we can. I do have a proper introduction for you. I know that unless you've been living in a cave for a couple of years, you probably know who Dr. Offit is. By the way, that might not have been a bad idea to be in a cave for a couple of years, but I will give you a proper introduction. Dr. Offit, you've seen him on CNN, CNBC, PBS NewsHour, even Dr. Oz. You are a pediatrician and a professor of pediatrics in the Division of Infectious Diseases and director of the Vaccine Education Center at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. You are an expert on vaccines, immunology, and virology. You are co-inventor of the rotavirus vaccine RotoTeq and a member of VRPAC, the FDA Vaccines and Related Biological Products Committee, otherwise known as the Vaccine Advisory Committee. You have published hundreds of papers in medical and scientific journals and are the author of 12 books, including Pandora's Lab, 7 Stories of Science Gone Wrong, Bad Advice, Why Celebrities, Politicians, and Activists Are Not Your Best Source of Health Information, Overkill, When Modern Medicine Goes Too Far, and your latest book, published last September, You Bet Your Life, From Blood Transfusions to Mass Vaccinations, The Long and Risky History of Medical Innovation. And I do have some questions about that, but first, as always, hopefully not as always, but as always for right now, COVID. All right. We're 13 months into vaccines. Can you give me your state of the situation year over year? I just checked yesterday. I was surprised. I thought it was better than this, but it looks like the U.S. vaccination rate's about 64%. Some states as low as 50%, some as high as 80%, but a lot of mid-50s in there. What's your assessment?
I think things are about to get better. And here's why I say that. Remembering, but I also picked the Philadelphia Eagles to beat the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and we were losing 31-0 at one point. So I probably shouldn't listen to me. But here's why I think that's true. Right now we have 90% population immunity, meaning from people who have either been vaccinated or naturally infected or both. Seroprevalence surveys show that we are at about 90% population immunity. That's good. The largest group of people actually who are unvaccinated and likely uninfected are actually people less than 30. So it's the younger people actually who are now sort of at specifically high risk. 2 is we are about to enter warmer weather. I mean, warm weather is an enemy of this virus at some level. Even if you look last year, as we moved from like November to December to January to February, and we didn't really have a vaccine that was available really till the end of December, and that was sort of available on a limited basis, and we had far fewer people who were naturally infected. We had much less population immunity. Nonetheless, when we hit last mid-February, you started to see a decline in the number of hospitalizations and the number of deaths, and that sort of continued to come down, especially during the summer months. It was way down, and then it came back up again as we moved into fall. So I do think things are going to get better soon because we have much higher population immunity. So that's good. I think that the other thing that's good is that the vaccines that were made, all of the vaccines, Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson's vaccine, AstraZeneca vaccine, all of them were made against the original strain, the so-called ancestral strain, the Wuhan strain. I mean, that's not the virus that left China. The virus that left China was the first variant, because it was more contagious. It didn't have a Greek letter designation. It was called D614G, but that's the one that swept across, Asia, Europe, and the U.S. And it was eventually replaced by Alpha because Alpha was more virulent, and then Delta because Delta was more virulent, and then Omicron because Omicron. I'm sorry, it was eventually replaced by Alpha because Alpha was more contagious, by Delta because Delta was more contagious, and by the Omicron because Omicron is actually a little more immune evasive is the problem. But the good news is that the protection against serious illness has held up. If you're vaccinated with 2 doses of an mRNA-containing vaccine or 2 doses of Johnson & Johnson vaccine, then you're not in a high-risk group. You are going to be protected against serious illness. So that's good. And then that's because protection against serious illness is mediated by memory cells, memory B cells, memory T helper cells, memory cytotoxic T cells, and those recognize those epitopes, those immunologic components that are fairly well conserved. So that's good. The one thing that does worry me, though, is Omicron, and not for the reasons you might think. What worries me about Omicron is not that if you're previously naturally infected or you're previously vaccinated, that you wouldn't be protected against serious disease, but that you are. It's the number of mutations on the receptor binding domain. That was a dramatic leap from where we were on Delta. I don't think anybody ever thought coronaviruses would act like flu, where you would actually call this drift. But I think this is drift, and you always worry that it's going to drift more. But for now, I think we're good.
So you're saying you're worried about the Omicron drifting more into like a super Omicron? Okay, go ahead. Or just
no, I'm worried that this virus now has the capacity to drift, and that although Omicron still retains those conformationally conserved epitopes that are recognized by memory B cells and T cells, that this virus may have the capacity to evade that, meaning to create mutations on those regions, those conserved regions. If that happens, then we're talking about another vaccine. Then we're talking about a variant-specific vaccine. We don't need a variant-specific vaccine yet. We'll see this Omicron sister virus. We're learning more about that. It may be a little more contagious. We'll see. But again, I don't think that virus is likely to escape protection against serious disease. I'll give you specifically an example of what I mean. During that Provincetown outbreak last July 4th, Provincetown, Massachusetts, right? So thousands of men get together, celebrate July 4th, and then there's an outbreak of COVID. Even though 79% of those men were vaccinated, fully vaccinated, nonetheless, 346 got COVID. 4 were hospitalized. That's a hospitalization rate of 1.2%. That's great. That's a vaccine that's working. I think if that was 10%, 20% or becomes 10% or 20% or 30%, now you're talking about a vaccine that's not working. So you need another vaccine. The one thing I wish we'd stop doing is counting cases. I mean, the natural infection or vaccination will protect against moderate to severe disease. It's not going to protect as well against mild disease. So you're going to see mild disease. I mean, you get a flu vaccine to protect you against moderate to severe disease. If you get a mild upper respiratory tract infection associated with flu, that's okay. And we treat this in a manner as if we're trying to get sterilizing immunity. We have this like zero tolerance for mild upper respiratory tract infections, and that's going to drive us, and is driving us crazy.
I will come back to that because I did have a specific question about that. But first, I want to go into public outreach, because did I hear you correctly the other day saying that you're going to be involved in some public outreach with doctors Ezekiel Emanuel and Anthony Fauci?
It's not public outreach. At least that's not my understanding.
Well, I don't have any clue. I kind of heard it go by, so that was my term. So you tell me what's going on.
Dr. Zeke Emanuel has put together a team that essentially advised the White House COVID team about sort of how we move into the new normal. That's what that is. So that's, I'm not sure when that will be made public, but the fact that it exists has already been made public. I know that Dr. Emanuel was on PBS NewsHour with Judy Woodruff talking about that. So that phenomenon is already public.
Okay, so you're working as a White House advisor then, going into this?
Well, I mean, we're working. I'm working on a team that will eventually advise the White House on this. Yeah.
Well, speaking of public outreach, I don't know if you followed this or not, but I read something about the Florida Surgeon General that was just confirmed. During the confirmation hearings, he sort of tacitly, begrudgingly admitted that the vaccines are effective and work. He's going to be the face of the health department in Florida. That's public outreach. He's an authority people can refer to. Do you have any comment on that, or you want to stay away from it?
No, sure. I mean, he was asked a very simple question: do vaccines work? And he was asked by that state senator to answer that as in a yes or no manner. That's an easy question to answer in a yes or no manner. Yes, they work. Because what's the definition of working? The definition of working is they are dramatically effective at preventing hospitalization and ICU admission and death. Dramatic. I mean, when you see hospitalization rates of 1% or so in people that are infected with COVID, that's excellent. That's working well. He eventually got to the answer. I mean, eventually he did say that these vaccines are effective at preventing severe disease. True. And then he said, but they're ineffective at preventing mild disease. That's not true. They're pretty effective. They're just not as effective at preventing mild disease. So it was a political answer. I mean, it tells you that he felt that at least the zeitgeist in Florida meant that he couldn't just come out and say vaccines work, which is, of course, absurd. Similarly, I mean, Governor DeSantis has continued to want to give monoclonal antibodies that don't recognized epitopes on Omicron. I mean, there is a monoclonal antibody that does do that, but that's not the one he was using. And he said, but he's seen that it works. Honestly, it can't work. It doesn't recognize any epitopes that's on that virus, so it can't work. So what he's saying is, people have gotten it and they've lived. Yeah, I believe that. I mean, people got hydroxychloroquine and lived. People I'm sure have put garlic around their necks and lived. It's not a proof.
Let's go back to what you were talking about with cases and the definitions of them. A few days ago in the Journal of American Medical Association, they published a research letter comparing Moderna and Pfizer breakthrough cases. But an interesting sentence was, this is how they defined it. We included breakthrough cases defined as positive lab tests for the presence of SARS-CoV-2 RNA. Okay, I see you're shaking your head. And my question I have for you is, a lot of people I know that have been diagnosed with COVID, they had no idea, but they were diagnosed because either their workplace or the school is testing everybody weekly. They got tested, they were positive, they have to stay home, a couple aches and pains. This JAMA letter defined that as a breakthrough case, apparently. What do you say?
It's the biggest communication error we made, I think, in explaining this vaccine. It was actually made around that Provincetown outbreak. When those 346 men got COVID and 4 were hospitalized, they described those other cases, mild cases, asymptomatic cases, as breakthroughs. That's not a breakthrough. A breakthrough means failure. That wasn't a failure. That's a vaccine doing what it's supposed to do. The notion that this vaccine can provide what researchers describe as sterilizing immunity, meaning that you're not going to get any symptomatic infection, that you're not even going to get an asymptomatic infection, is ridiculous, because these kinds of viruses or these kinds of vaccines don't work that way. The influenza vaccine protects you against moderate to severe illness. It doesn't protect you very well against mild illness or asymptomatic infection. The vaccine we developed at Children's Hospital Philadelphia, the rotavirus vaccine, keeps babies out of the hospital and keeps them out of the ICU. But babies, despite vaccination, may still get a mild or asymptomatic infection. That's okay. And I think, I don't know if you ever listened to, there's another podcast called This Week in Virology. Vince Racaniello out of Columbia does that. But John Udell, who actually, he and I trained together in a flu lab many decades ago at the Wistar Institute, he was on that show, at least the last one I heard, and he said it best. He said, your immune system did not evolve to make you PCR negative. True.
Well, speaking of Dr. Jonathan Udell, he wrote several months ago, get COVID or get a vaccine, right? That's your choice. Now we're kind of hearing get a vaccine and get COVID as well, but it'll be a mild case. Is that the new messaging?
Well, that's always should have been the message. I think where we got seduced, if you will, was back in December of 2020 when we looked at the phase 3 trials. I mean, I'm on the FDA's Vaccine Advisory Committee. When we looked at those trials, what you had, whether it was Moderna or Pfizer, is you had 95% efficacy against all symptomatic illness, including mild illness. Those vaccines showed 95% efficacy against mild illness, but those were 3-month trials. Those participants in those trials had just gotten a second dose. So they had high levels of neutralizing antibodies, which is what mediates protection against mild illness. But high levels of neutralizing antibodies don't last long. So what happens is over time that will come down, which is what happened. And so the infection rate, meaning asymptomatic infection or mildly symptomatic infection rate, will go up. That's okay. And I think the whole booster thing has been especially confusing because you can argue reasonably that this pre-pandemic was probably always a 3-dose vaccine for certain groups, people over 65. People who are immune compromised, people who live in long-term care facilities. I think that's true. And also arguably people who have comorbidities that are over 50 years of age. But if you're trying to prevent mild illness by giving a booster, you will for about 3 months. I mean, that's what will happen. You'll boost your neutralizing antibodies, and for 3 months, you'll be protected now. And then those neutralizing antibodies will come back down again. That's not a public health strategy. You can't just keep giving booster doses to keep neutralizing antibodies up so that you can prevent mild illness. The question is, has this vaccine held up in terms of protection against serious disease? And with the exception of those groups I just mentioned, it has. And that's why I've really had a problem, and this is for what I've gotten a fair amount of hate mail. I do have a problem with recommending booster doses for healthy young people. It just doesn't make sense to me. I don't see the point of it. Similarly, and this also has gotten me a fair amount of hate mail because I was on another podcast called Z-Dog MD, but I think that all the evidence from the CDC is that natural infection protects. So if you can say, look, I've been naturally infected, do I really need to be vaccinated or do I need to be boosted? I think the answer is you can make that argument. And where that becomes important is people who've lost their jobs because they haven't gotten the vaccine, even though they've been naturally infected, or they can't go to the university they want to go to, school they want to go to, work in a job, work in a particular place they want to work. I just think that's wrong. But again, it's been hard to get people to understand this.
I guess I should apologize for asking you basically the same questions that you have to answer over and over and over again. When you're talking about the boosters, I mean, just last Friday, there were 3 drops all on the same day, right? 3 papers about boosters, 2 from the CDC, 1 from JAMA. I think one of the CDCs, they were comparing vaccinated with and without boosters, so at least they were doing both. Just today, something popped in like a half hour ago from the British UK Health Security Agency that boosters significantly reduce the risk of death from Omicron about 6 months after and all this stuff. So they are really being pushed in all ages. So you think that's a messaging error? Because, I mean, if somebody were on the verge, I guess, of going out to get their first dose and they'd committed to the second dose, if they hear they're going to need a third dose, that might push them over the edge, I suppose. I don't know.
All I would argue is where's the evidence that a third dose, let's say, of an mRNA-containing vaccine, statistically significantly decreases your incidence of serious disease in healthy young people. And I can include both of those words, healthy and young. I believe that people who have comorbidities are at increased risk and will likely benefit from the third dose. But healthy young people, I mean, those 18 to 25-year-olds who are going back to school, who are being required to get a third dose, all I'm saying is where's the evidence that matters for protection against serious illness? I believe it matters for protection against mild illness, for at least for a few months. But if you're going to require it, if you're going to mandate it, then I think you have to have clear evidence for that because like any medical product, vaccines are now without risk. I mean, we know that the mRNA vaccines can cause myocarditis, which fortunately appears to be, short-lived and temporary and self-resolving, and that's all good. But you can bet that over time, as we learn more and more about myocarditis, there may be a spectrum of illness. I mean, that's invariably the case. But if you look 6 months later, a year later, and you do cardiac MRIs, are you going to see any evidence for residual scarring? I don't know. But I know that, and I certainly know vaccines work. I think vaccines need to be given. I think this entire population should be vaccinated, and then we can put this pandemic behind us. It's the booster story that I have problems with. Because if you're making an argument that if you want to use the word booster, realize that means you're boosting something. What are you boosting? You're boosting neutralizing antibodies for a relatively short period of time. Or are you making the case that the only way you can get high frequencies of memory T and B cells is to have a 3-dose vaccine? Fine. And that I think is a reasonable argument for certain groups, certainly for people over 70. I mean, those data are clear. I think certainly for people who are immune compromised, that I believe. And I think people with comorbidities, likely. But I just feel like we're being asked to do something for which there is not clear evidence. If the CDC has clear evidence that a booster vaccine decreases hospitalizations in healthy young people, please show that to us, because that was not in either of those 2 MMWR papers or that JAMA paper that came out that was associated with a press release where they said that, where they said booster dosing for all. They've recommended booster doses down to 12 years of age. I just don't see it.
It's kind of oddly amusing that you get hate mail both sides. So you get hate mail if you recommend a vaccination, and then if you say, we don't need a third one, then you get hate mail from that side. You cannot win. and you go with the Eagles.
Right, exactly right.
So, but let's talk about the myocarditis, because there have been several studies about that now, and I know that this Klein et al. Study from September, they found it like 1 in 100,000. The original BARDA study, it was 1 to 5 in 100,000. Just recently, there was a study that came out. I think it was, let me look, I think I have it here. Another JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association investigation, I think on January 25th, that analyzed some VAERS data, but they also subgrouped it a lot. And they found it to be maybe 5 per 100,000. That's still in the acceptable risk category.
Right, that's right. So VAERS is hard because it's I mean, everything has to be followed up because there's no screening for anybody can report to VAERS. It should be called SVAERS, meaning Suspected Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System, because you don't know whether it's really truly related. But no, I think there was actually also a recent paper looking at the incidence of myocarditis following mRNA vaccination as compared to myocarditis following disease. This was a really good study. It came out of sort of the EPIC system, which is this electronic medical record system. You are 17 times more likely to get myocarditis if you're naturally infected than if you're vaccinated. Because Rand Paul's been pushing this lately, that you're more likely to get myocarditis with vaccination than natural infection, and that's not true. It's also more severe. I mean, certainly with MIS-C, with this multi-system inflammatory disease, this post-infectious inflammatory phenomenon of the 5 to 13-year-old, that myocarditis is certainly more severe.
They also had published, again, Journal of American Medical Association, this interesting study on nocebo adverse events. I don't know if you saw that, but the placebo group had 50% of the same adverse events as the vaccination group in the trials, and they kind of tacitly surmised that was because it was exacerbated by warnings of adverse events. I don't know if you read it or not, but that was kind of surprising to me that people, I know you can get site pain, of course, you're getting an injection after all, but headache, fatigue, these other associated adverse events from the vaccine. And I will tell you that I never read warning labels because I will get every symptom if I read the warning label of adverse events. So I get it. It's exacerbated by telling people that this is what can happen. Can you comment on that?
I think it works both ways. I mean, I think there is a placebo response, meaning this has been shown in many ways. If you, for example, give someone a medicine and you say, I really think this is going to work for you, as distinct from, well, I hope this works for you, or we'll see whether this works for you. It's actually more likely to work if you set the expectation that it's going to work. I mean, those kinds of studies have been done. That's placebo, I think, from the Latin, to please. Nocebo, sort of from nocere, meaning to harm. You do the other thing. You say, you may want to watch out for, for this, or this, and then suddenly those things happen because you think they're going to happen. Which is to say, Milton, I think, right? The mind can make a heaven of hell and a hell of heaven. I think it's a powerful thing.
All right, let's jump back to drift that you're concerned about because this follows into my next question. Have you been, I heard about this Walter Reed Supervax and Supervax with nanoparticles, very exciting. Have you been following that? Can you comment on that? What's that all about?
Yeah, so what those researchers did was they took ferritin and basically were able to cause it to be in a conformational shape that sort of looked like a small soccer ball, and then you could, on each of those faces of the soccer ball, stick a SARS-CoV-2 spike protein, and the hope being that then it would be sort of more of a pan-coronavirus vaccine. But again, I just make this argument, and Dr. Fauci actually was on TV the other day talking about a pan-coronavirus vaccine. Which in theory was going to recognize conformational epitopes across all coronaviruses, SARS-1, MERS, the 4 human coronaviruses. There's about 9 I think the SARS-CoV-2, I think is the 9th coronavirus. Then that's great, but it is highly aspirational. I mean, it's as much easier said, more easily said than done. People have been working on a universal influenza vaccine for 40 years. I actually trained in a flu lab back in the early 1980s with a guy named Walter Gerhardt at the Wistar Institute. He was working on a universal flu vaccine, and it seems obvious, right? We'll just take those regions of the virus that are conformationally conserved across all strains and use that as a vaccine. But it's just much harder than you remember. There's 4 strains of human coronavirus that circulate every year in this country. And there are some shared epitopes among those there are T helper cell epitopes that are recognized among those 4 strains that are also found in SARS-CoV-2. And that may have actually helped us. I mean, it's possible that sort of population immunity with those 4 human coronaviruses has modified the effect of this virus, which is frightening to think of how bad it would have been had that not been true. So that's been raised as a possibility. But making universal vaccines is not easy. Something Dr. Gerhardt said to me when we were training in that lab, and one of the other people I was training with then was John Udell. I mean, he was also in that lab. And what Dr. Gerhardt said, I remember he said, if you want a research career that lasts for the rest of your life, study influenza.
What about the Hotez vaccine? What's it called? Corebricks or something? It's is that coming up for review under the FDA? And that should be one that can go. Oh, you haven't heard on that? No trials yet?
I don't know. I mean, so the way that's done a little differently than the mRNA vaccines, in that it's a purified protein vaccine, but it's not like the hepatitis B vaccine, which is the whole surface protein, or the human papillomavirus vaccine, which is the whole surface protein, or the Novavax vaccine, which is the whole SARS-CoV-2 spike protein. This is actually just the receptor binding domain. So it'll be interesting to see efficacy studies. They've done, you've seen studies, at least I've seen studies, or at least seen press reports, because that's where we are these days, of like neutralizing antibodies. And that certainly looked very promising. And they use an interesting adjuvant, this so-called CpG motif, which is cytosine, guanine, linked by a phosphodiester linkage, which makes your body think it's being infected by a bacteria. So it quickly makes it sort of simulates the innate immune system. It's used in actually one of the hepatitis B vaccines, Heplisav B. So love to see those data. Love to see the trials. Right now, we're just looking at neutralizing antibodies, but also, you want to make sure, and Dr. Hotez can comment on this far more informed than I am, but you make sure that as when you get to a smaller part of the protein, that you're not in any way eliminating those conformational epitopes that are recognized by memory cells.
What's the latest on the vaccine trials in 6 to 24 months? Children under 5. I know it didn't work so well the first time around. Any word on that? Are they up again?
I know as much as you do, meaning which is to say I read the same things you do on this. I'm on the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee. You'd think I would have more information about this. I don't. Well, I will when Pfizer submits. Pfizer said that they're going to submit in March. What I've heard, probably what you've heard, is that, I'll take a step back. When the studies were done in the 5 to 11-year-old, that was a 10 microgram dose, which is a third of what was given to the 12 to 15-year-old, which was a 30 microgram dose, which is the same dose that was given to adults. So with the 5 to 11-year-old, they dropped down to a third of the dose. But nonetheless, if you looked at, and it's sort of an arbitrary gathering, right? Why 5 to 11? Why not 4 to 11? I mean, is there a big difference between the 4 and 5-year-old? No. So you're basically arbitrarily picking an age range, 5 to 11. Fortunately, it didn't matter whether you were 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, or 11. When you got that 10 microgram dose, you got a very good neutralizing antibody response, and that vaccine was 91% effective in the trial, that roughly 2,400 child trial that they did. And now it's been in at least 8 million children, and is safe, and there's not been a single case of myocarditis. So that's good. So now you drop down to the less than 5-year-old. Now the dose is not 10 micrograms, 3 micrograms. And my understanding, and again, I don't know this, it's just sort of what I've sort of heard or read, from the news reports, is that while it seemed to be induced neutralizing antibodies in the younger group, it didn't induce it as well in the older group, meaning like, I guess, the 3 and 4-year-old. And so hence they were going to do a third dose. So I don't know. I really don't know. We'll see it when we see it, but I can promise you this: we're by the time we see it, we're going to be heading into spring, and there'll be less of a pressure, I think, from the pandemic, I think. But I am not going to vote yes on this unless there is a robust safety database and a robust efficacy trial. I think we have to see that. We'll see.
You work at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. I mean, what are you seeing in terms of admissions from children? And no specifics, but just statistically, what the age ranges are, how sick are they? Is it COVID? What?
Yeah, so what we do in our hospital is any child who comes into the hospital for whatever reason, whether it's because of COVID or they just happen to have COVID, everybody gets tested for COVID who comes to the hospital. So a few weeks ago, it was like 30% of those who came into the hospital had COVID, although many were not coming in because of the COVID. And the ICU, we had a certain number of ICU admissions. This past week, I just saw the data this morning. It's definitely down. It's definitely come down. The number of kids who are coming into the hospital with COVID or coming to the ICU with COVID. So we have turned the corner in the city, as appears to be true also in many cities in the Northeast.
Do you see spread among the hospital staff? Or are you guys, are masking and all this is working still?
We're pretty good. I mean, it's like walk into the hospital, looks like we're all walking through plutonium. I mean, we have the N95 respirators, we've got, goggles, we have gloves, gowns. We're pretty good. I feel pretty safe in the hospital.
Okay, great. I mean, I'm sporting the COVID do. If you think I look hideous, I know my hair is a bit of a mess, but I'm kind of nervous about going to the hairdresser, though I have been to the dentist several times for routine stuff, and I wasn't scared there. But Let's move on. You bet your life. This is something I've wanted to talk to you about. So you mentioned in the book Xenotransplantation, pig heart transplants by the end of 2020. It has actually happened. Have you been following that? And what do you want to say about it? I mean,
a couple things. First of all, so I had said in the book that I thought that so there's 4,000 people roughly that are awaiting heart transplantation. About a certain 4,000 are awaiting heart transplantation, but as many as 1,300 will die while waiting. I mean, hearts are precious. It's hard to find them. And so what do you do? Knowing that you may be one of those people who is going to die while waiting, what do you do? So this was at the University of Maryland, where there was a pig heart transplant, a genetically modified pig heart. So you can genetically modify pig valves, you can genetically modify the pig heart so that you're less likely to see proteins on the surface of that pig's heart that you will see as foreign and therefore reject the heart. So that was a successful transplant. We'll see how that plays out. The other thing that was interesting, actually, just because it gets back to COVID, because everything's always COVID all the time, was that transplant in Boston, where there was a young man, I think he was in his 30s, who refused vaccination. And so therefore they would, even though he was up for a heart transplant, I think their heart transplant was there for him, they wouldn't transplant him because hearts are precious, and why should it go to somebody who's going to put themselves at risk? Because when you get a heart transplant, you're going to be given immune suppressive therapies, which means that you're at especially high risk of SARS. Why should that person get a transplant as compared to somebody who's going to take care of themselves and make that transplant much more likely to work? So that got sort of was mixed reaction in the press. Some people were for it, some people were against it. But it's not unusual for any transplant that if you're not taking care of yourself, that you sort of move down on the list.
What, was he up for another pig heart transplant, or was that?
I never heard about a pig part with him. What the father had said, as I just read this paper, what the father said about his son who's refusing vaccination, he said, quote, he believes in it very strongly, so much so that he's willing to die for that belief, which is amazing. It's like if you look at it's amazing how strongly held these beliefs are. You look at Kyrie Irving, who can't play at home again for the Brooklyn Nets at home because you have to be vaccinated if you're going to walk into Brooklyn Nets Stadium, and so he forfeits $17 million because he's getting 2 shots. You're not asking him to get a heart transplant. Just get 2 shots, and you get $17 million. And then you look at Novak Djokovic, who could defend his Australian Open title, who could be the won more Grand Slam titles than anybody in history, but no, he doesn't get a vaccine, so he doesn't get to do that. It's a vaccine. I don't get it. I really don't get it. It's hard to me to understand this.
Have they proven that they were actually exposed so that they had COVID? And would that, if they had it and they're now have that natural immunity, would that play back into what you said at the beginning, people getting fired even?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think the ship has sailed on this. While it is true that if you've been naturally infected and you get a vaccine, that you will have a boost in your immune response. Not surprising. Do you need it is the question. Does it really cause you to have longer lived protection against serious illness? And I think for certain groups that might be true, but for otherwise healthy young people, I think there is not evidence for that. The CDC just published data on January 28th showing natural infections highly protective as vaccination, at least in that study, which was sort of at the end of the Delta experience.
Well, I don't follow sports. I know these guys are sports people and forfeiting $17 million, but something got in his head that cost him $17 million. That's for sure.
Amazing.
Back to You Bet Your Life. With all these developments in mRNA technology, there's no respiratory syncytial virus vaccine, RSV. Are you hopeful for that? Is this technology going to help you with that? Because you have a whole chapter in there on medical advancements, vaccines, one of the biggest medical advancements. So what about RSV and the new technology? Does that look promising, or do you...
Well, Moderna is working on mRNA vaccine for RSV. We'll see. And certainly there are... the mRNA technology is now being applied to a better malaria, or not, but just a better malaria vaccine, a better tuberculosis vaccine, maybe a universal flu vaccine. But you're always, I think the point of the book, You Bet Your Life, is that you always learn as you go. Always. There is no example for any of the 9 major advances I talk about in this book. Whether it's antibiotics or vaccines or chemotherapy or biologicals, where you haven't had to pay some sort of price for knowledge. That's just the way it goes, and we never accept that. We can't believe it, right? I mean, even just for these technologies, no one would have predicted myocarditis as a consequence of mRNA vaccines. No one would have predicted this blood clotting problem with Johnson & Johnson or AstraZeneca's vaccine, which can be fatal, rare, but real. No one would have predicted that, because you always learn as you go, which is why at the beginning of this, I actually talk about this in the book a little bit, because the book was started before the pandemic, but was written during the pandemic. The statements by the CEOs of two of the pharmaceutical companies where, when they had done phase 1 trials involving maybe 25 or 30 people, and then they would say, like, well, and we can make tens of millions of doses. How about a little slow down? Nature gives up its secrets slowly, grudgingly, and with a human price. There is going to be a price to pay. There always is. How about a little humility? Because nature demands that.
Well, in your book, you go through 9 things, right? So vaccines, antibiotics, I can't list them all, anesthesia, serendipity, things like that. But there are other things that you've spoken about before, such as preventive things such as Semmelweis and hand washing, vitamin C and nutrition from Lind, the guy with the cholera RCTs, the first RCTs with cholera in London. I can't remember his name. Do you think mask wearing is going to be the new basic preventative that'll be the new etiquette, like hand washing and nutrition and things like that? Is this our new normal?
I think for some people it will be. It's certainly in other countries. And if you go to Japan in the winter, I mean, people wear masks. It's so there are. It is that culture. You have to wear a tight-fitting mask. It can't be just a mask that's sort of hanging out around your mouth but doesn't cover your nose, or just the surgical masks are good but not perfect. I mean, it's really the KN95s or N95s, or certainly. But wearing an N95 for a day is pretty darn uncomfortable. But I'm sure that as things settle down, you're still going to see people wearing masks. At least a certain group of people will still wear masks.
And I have one final question for you. It's Dr. Paul Offit. It's a hypothetical here. Well, first let me ask you, did you go to Eagles games or did you watch on TV?
Well, I didn't go to Eagles games. Well, last year you couldn't go to Eagles games. This year I just didn't. I did, yes. I went to 2 Eagles games this year. Actually, one game I sat in the owner's box. That was cool. And then another game, another friend actually had a box. So although normally we just sit down there, down there with the rest of the world down there, but just happened to be that I was asked to be in these boxes. So
okay, yeah, so you went out into a big crowd with a mask and everything, and you felt perfectly comfortable with that.
I mean, I'm vaccinated. I'm over 65, so I'm boosted. I wear a mask when I'm around those people. But when we were all in, you couldn't get into that box unless you were vaccinated. Everybody had to be vaccinated to be vaccinated. So I think that if you're vaccinated and you're asymptomatic, the likelihood that you're shedding a quantity of infectious virus that puts others at risk is really, really small. And see, that's the problem with the PCR test that you were talking about earlier. I mean, there was a study that was just done and reported in the last couple of weeks or so, where what they did was they took people who were vaccinated and had mild illness, and they compared it to people who weren't vaccinated but had mild illness. So the nature of the symptomatic illness was the same in those two groups. And they looked at the thing you really care about, which is not doing an antigen test, and it's not doing a PCR test. It's doing the quantity of infectious virus that's being secreted. So you take, swabs from the nose or throat, and then you go to the laboratory, because this is not a commercially available test, and you do plaquing assays, or you do focus forming assays, which tells you the quantity of infectious virus, the infectious virus titer. That's what you want to know. The higher the infectious virus titer, the more likely you are to be contagious. The lower, the less likely. So what they found was that if you looked at PCR in those two groups, there was no difference. Even if you looked at cycle times, which is going to detect more or less viral RNA, no difference. I mean, the lower the cycle time, the more the viral RNA. And the thinking was always, well, if that's true, if it's a cycle time of 10 as compared to a cycle time of 50, then there's more viral RNA. Therefore, there must be more infectious virus. That was wrong. So what they found was that if you were vaccinated and had a mild illness, you shed much less virus for a much shorter period of time than someone who was unvaccinated who had a mild illness. So that was another communications error that came out of that Provincetown outbreak. What they did was they looked at PCR one day afterwards in people who were vaccinated and unvaccinated and didn't see a difference and said, you're just as contagious. And that was wrong. You're less contagious if you're vaccinated, clearly less contagious. So see, people heard that and they thought, so what difference does it make whether I get vaccinated or not? I'm going to be as contagious either way. And that's not true. So there was a lot of, and I think the other communications there was, I think when President Biden stood up on August 18th and said, as of September 20th, we're going to have booster dosing available for everybody over 16, thus sending the message that 2 doses wasn't protective, when it is protective for most people, most certainly healthy young people. So I think we keep inadvertently damning this vaccine, and I think have caused somewhat of a loss of confidence, I think, in the agencies that are making recommendations, sadly, because they couldn't be more dedicated. I mean, to know people like Rochelle Walensky at the CDC or Tony Fauci at NIAID or Vivek Murthy at the Surgeon General's office, these are great people. I mean, they're wonderful scientists. They couldn't work harder for the American public to try and do the right thing. But I think some of the messaging has been confounding.
And also, there's been so much messaging in about a year. I mean, there's been so much coming in. It's just unbelievable. I think a PubMed search a year ago yielded 30,000 papers. I just did it yesterday. It's 222,000 papers. I mean, it's ridiculous, the amount of information to digest and then put into a simple soundbite that gets on TV. I mean, that's, all right, so 2 last questions. One is, look in your crystal ball. It's October 2022. You're Dr. Paul Offit. You got a new book, You Bet Your Life. You're invited to come speak at a convention in Las Vegas. You got to fly out there, hang out with 500 people. How you feel about doing that?
I would do that.
Oh, really?
I imagine I would do that. I would. I mean, you're talking about that skeptics conference.
Anything that you get called, you go do dinners and speeches everywhere that you have to fly.
I go out to dinner. I go out to dinner here.
But I mean, in a large group like that where you have to fly. Okay, that's great.
I think I'm vaccinated and boosted. And I would wear a mask on the plane. I think I would wear a mask when I'm sitting down. I think I would wear a mask until I feel like we're over this particular hump. I would wear it. Now we may get over this hump. I mean, this Omicron hump we may soon get over in the next couple of weeks, and then we'll see what emerges next winter. But this is a winter virus, and I think we'll see it again next winter. We'll see it throughout the year, but I think it'll really sort of come up more in the winter months because that's what happened the last few years. And
you're correct. I was referring to Cycon 22. I think they announced the dates. I just thought, am I going to have the guts to go? All right, last question. When I interviewed you about overkill, you were actually already working on You Bet Your Life. You Bet Your Life, it's finished, it's out. I must ask, what are you working on now?
No, I think I'm interested in another book. This book, the working title is Contagious. I'm sorry, it's Casualties. Casualties is the working title. And the subtitle is How a War Against a Virus Became a War Against Ourselves. It's all the things that caused us to continue to allow this virus to spread and mutate and create variants because we just simply refuse to do the things we need to do to end this pandemic in a manner much worse than in many other countries. And I'm just trying to sort of get at what actually is behind all that. That's the purpose of this book.
Oh, and so you are actually writing. Oh, wow. Well, congratulations. Well, that'll be an interesting read, especially because the information is timely and it's going to remain timely. But I mean, that's a book that you'll have to update after it gets published. Like You Bet Your Life.
Now I'm done the book that the pandemic will be fastest, given how slowly I'm getting this done. So.
All right, Dr. Offit, I greatly appreciate your being here once again. Enjoy the rest of the winter. I hope to see you at some point. Is there a final comment you'd like to make?
No, just hang in there. We're almost there. I really do think we're going to get past this Omicron wave, or whatever you want to call it, flash flood, and then just if we could just vaccinate, especially people less than 30, because they're the groups that are least vaccinated right now. So I think pediatricians really need to up their game here and try and make sure everybody gets vaccinated. We've had a vaccine for 5 to 11-year-olds for almost 3 months now, and 19% of 5 to 11-year-olds are vaccinated. When we ran at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, kids get admitted who are over 5 years of age and go to the ICU, and none of them were ever vaccinated. It's really hard to watch.
What do their parents say? Can I ask that question?
Parents aren't vaccinated either, nor the siblings.
So I got to say, I mean, do you have a follow-up conversation?
It's hard because you have a child who's suffering. And to bring up the issue of not vaccinating them or them not getting vaccinated, it's another level of guilt. It's hard to have that conversation. what you can say is, and I've said this, is, remember one family, I said to the mother, do you have children at home? Yes. Have they been sick? No. Have they been vaccinated? No. Could you please consider vaccinating them since COVID is in your home? And no, wasn't going to do it.
Oh, still no?
And it was interesting is the father was vaccinated. And I asked the father why he was vaccinated. He said, because I have to be vaccinated for work. So mandates do work at some level.
So nothing educates like the disease, right? That's the quote. Apparently that's not true in this case.
No, because people just deny what's in front of them. That's where, I never saw that movie, Don't Look Up. That's sort of the basis of that movie, how we're able to simply just deny something that is right in front of us.
I know it would be a difficult conversation. You don't want to make anybody feel more guilty, but the only thing that might come out of that would be what went wrong with the messaging? What happened? And I guess,
I think it's a cultural thing. It's become the zeitgeist. It's how people identify themselves. I'm not gonna go with this government bullshit. I'm gonna do what I want to do. They're not gonna tell me what to do. They're not gonna tell me to wear a mask. They're not gonna tell me to get a vaccine. I'm in charge of my own fate. And so get off my back. And you're a tough guy, right? Just don't tell me to do that. Don't tell me I have to mask my children. Don't have to tell me I have to vaccinate my children. It's just part of the cultural identity, which is ingrained and hard to shake.
Geez, was that the great note I wanted to end on? So no, hang in there. We're going to get through this. Things are looking up. That's the message, right?
That's right. Yes.
All right, Dr. Offit. Dr. Offit has been my guest here on 502 Conversations. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're
Take care.
welcome.
Talk to you soon.